In the autumn of 1889, the town of Millbrook sat quiet beneath the Pennsylvania hills like a secret waiting to be spoken. The streets were unpaved dirt that turned to mud when it rained, and the buildings stood close together as if huddled against the cold that would soon arrive. It was a town of perhaps 300 souls, most of them workers in the lumber mill or farmers tending the rocky soil that stretched toward the mountains. Thomas Whitmore had lived in Millbrook for 24 years, ever since the war had ended, and he had drifted north with nothing but the clothes on his back and a determination to disappear. He was 58 years old now, his hair gone grey, his body still strong from decades of labor. He worked as a carpenter, building cabins and barns and coffins when needed, his hands skilled with wood in ways that made people trust him even if they never quite warmed to him. He lived alone in a small house at the edge of town, a structure he had built himself with careful attention to every joint and beam. The house had 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that kept the winter at bay. He kept to himself mostly, attending church on Sundays but never lingering for conversation, nodding politely to neighbors but never inviting them closer. The people of Millbrook had learned to accept his quietness as simply his nature, the way some men are. What they noticed most about Thomas Whitmore were his eyes. In a face weathered by years of outdoor work, in a complexion that marked him as one of the few colored men in Millbrook, those eyes were startling. They were pale blue, clear as winter ice, impossible to ignore. Children stared at him in the street until their mothers hushed them. Adults glanced away quickly, as if looking too long might be improper. And Thomas had learned long ago to keep his gaze lowered, to make himself as unremarkable as possible despite the one feature that made him forever remarkable. The autumn brought with it a visitor that would change everything. His name was Samuel Hendricks, and he arrived in Millbrook on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, riding in a hired carriage that kicked up dust along the main road. Hendricks was perhaps 60 years old, well-dressed in a dark suit that spoke of city money, his beard neatly trimmed and his manner commanding. He carried himself like a man accustomed to being obeyed, and when he stepped down from the carriage in front of the general store, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Thomas was repairing the steps of the church when he saw the carriage arrive. Something cold moved through his chest, a feeling he could not name but recognized as danger. He set down his hammer and watched as Hendricks spoke to the store owner, watched as the man pointed toward the edge of town, toward Thomas's house, watched as Hendricks nodded and climbed back into his carriage. That evening, as the sun was setting and Thomas was putting away his tools, he heard the sound of wheels on the dirt path that led to his door. He stood very still, his hands stilling on the handle of his saw, and waited. The knock came firm and deliberate, the knock of someone who expected to be answered. Thomas opened the door. Hendricks stood on his small porch, hat in hand, his expression pleasant but his eyes sharp and evaluating. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other, and Thomas felt as if the earth had shifted beneath his feet, as if the past he had spent decades burying was rising up through the ground like bones working their way to the surface. "Good evening," Hendricks said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I'm looking for a man who once went by another name, a man who was born in Virginia in the year 1828, a man with very distinctive eyes." Thomas said nothing, his hand tightened on the door frame. "May I come in?" Hendricks asked, though it was not really a question. "I believe we have matters to discuss that are best spoken of privately." Thomas stepped aside and let the man enter. His house was simple and clean, a single room with a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, shelves holding his few possessions. Hendricks looked around with the careful assessment of someone taking inventory, noting the quality of the furniture Thomas had built, the order of the space, the absence of any personal effects that might tell a story. "You've built a quiet life here," Hendricks observed, settling himself into one of the chairs without being invited. "Respectable, anonymous, I imagine that was the intention." Thomas remained standing, his back to the fireplace. "What do you want?" "Straight to the matter, then. I appreciate directness." Hendricks set his hat on the table and folded his hands. "I represent the estate of Edmund Hartwell, Jr. of Charlottesville, Virginia. You may remember him as Ned Hartwell. He died 3 months ago, leaving behind certain documents and a rather complicated legal situation. The name struck Thomas like a blow, though he kept his face carefully neutral. Ned, the boy who had thrown rocks at him, who had reported him to his mother for imaginary offenses, who had looked at him with inherited hatred in his young eyes. Before his death, Hendricks continued, Mr. Hartwell made certain confessions to his attorney, confessions regarding events that took place in the spring of 1851 at the Hartwell plantation. Events involving his mother's death and the sudden departure of a young slave with distinctive blue eyes. Thomas felt his heart hammering in his chest, but his voice came out steady. I don't know what you're speaking of. Come now, Mr. Whitmore, or should I say Daniel? Hendricks smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Ned Hartwell knew the truth about his mother's death. His father told him eventually on his deathbed in 1867. The knowledge haunted Ned for 22 years. He was tormented by guilt, by the complicity of his family in covering up a murder. It wasn't murder, Thomas said quietly. It was self-defense. Hendricks leaned back in his chair, satisfaction crossing his face. So you don't deny it. That makes matters simpler. Thomas realized his mistake too late. After decades of silence, of careful anonymity, he had spoken the truth aloud to a stranger who had come seeking exactly that admission. What do you want? He asked again. Ned Hartwell left a will, Hendricks explained, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. A peculiar will, full of moral anguish and attempts at posthumous redemption. He left a substantial sum of money, $20,000, to be given to the man known as Daniel, born at Hartwell Plantation in 1828, if such a man could be found. He also left a detailed account of what his father told him about the events of April 1851. Thomas stared at the document in Hendricks's hands. $20,000 was an impossible sum, enough money to transform a life entirely, to buy land, to build a future. It was also a trap. It had to be. Why would he do that? Thomas asked. Guilt, I suppose, conscience, the need to make amends for his family's sins before facing whatever judgment awaits us all. Hendricks unfolded the document and held it out. According to this account, you killed Catherine Hartwell in self-defense after she attempted to murder you. Edmund Hartwell covered up the crime to protect the family reputation, claiming his wife had taken her own life. He then sold you to another owner to remove you from the situation. Thomas took the document with trembling hands and read the words written in careful legal script. It was all there, every detail he had tried to forget, laid out in black ink on white paper. His mother's sale, Catherine's hatred, the broken window and the struggle and the gun going off, Edmund finding them, the lie that had saved his life. This account, Hendricks said quietly, could destroy what remains of the Hartwell family's reputation. Ned's children still live in Charlottesville. They are respectable people, prominent in society. If this information became public, if people knew that their grandmother was not a victim of melancholy, but was killed by a slave she tried to murder, if they knew their grandfather covered up a crime and lied to the authorities, the scandal would be devastating. So this is blackmail, Thomas said flatly. No, Hendricks's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes were cold. This is an opportunity for discretion on all sides. I am authorized to offer you a choice. You can accept the $20,000, sign a legal document confirming your identity and agreeing never to speak publicly about the events of 1851. The money will allow you to live comfortably for the rest of your days, and the Hartwell family's reputation will remain intact. Or you can refuse. In which case, I will be forced to take certain steps to ensure that this unfortunate history does not surface. The threat hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. If Thomas refused, Hendricks would find ways to make his life difficult, perhaps even dangerous. A colored man with a past connection to a white woman's death, even one from decades ago, was vulnerable in ways that no amount of time could erase. I need time to think, Thomas said. Of course, Hendricks stood and retrieved his hat. I'm staying at the boarding house on Main Street. I'll return tomorrow evening for your answer. I trust you'll make the wise choice, Mr. Whitmore. After Hendricks left, Thomas sat alone in the darkness, the document still in his hands, and felt the weight of the past settling over him like a shroud. The next day, Thomas tried to work, but his hands were unsteady and his mind elsewhere. He was repairing a wagon wheel for a farmer named Hutchins, but he kept making small mistakes, measuring incorrectly, fitting pieces that did not align. Finally, Hutchins told him kindly to go home, that the work could wait, that he looked unwell. Thomas walked back through town in the late afternoon light, aware of how people were watching him. Word had spread quickly that a well-dressed stranger was asking questions about the colored carpenter, about his past, about where he had come from. In a town as small as Millbrook, such interest did not go unnoticed. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson turned away when he entered, suddenly very interested in arranging cans on a shelf. Her daughter Mary, who was perhaps 16 and usually greeted him with a shy smile when he came to buy supplies, kept her eyes down. The store owner, Garrett Moore, was polite but distant, his usual easy manner replaced with something careful and watchful. "Heard you had a visitor last night," Moore said as he counted out nails into a paper bag. "City fellow, lawyer type." "Just some business," Thomas said quietly. "None of mine, I'm sure." But Moore's tone suggested otherwise, suggested that, in fact, everyone's business in Millbrook was everyone else's business, especially when it involved strangers asking questions. As Thomas left the store, he heard the whispers start behind him, voices lowered, but not enough that he could not make out the words. "What's a lawyer want with him? Must be something from before. You know he never talks about where he came from. Those eyes always knew there was something strange." The whispers followed him through town like shadows, and by the time he reached his house, Thomas felt as if the walls were closing in. He had built his life in Millbrook on silence and distance, on being unremarkable despite his remarkable eyes. Now that careful construction was crumbling, and he could feel the town's suspicion growing like mold in damp wood. That evening there was another knock at his door. Thomas opened it expecting Hendricks, but instead found Margaret Foster standing on his porch. She was the schoolteacher, perhaps 35 years old, one of the few people in town who had ever shown him genuine kindness. She was a widow, her husband killed in a mill accident 5 years earlier, and she lived alone in a small house near the school. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice low and urgent, "may I speak with you?" He let her in, surprised by her presence. They had spoken before, but only briefly, the kind of polite conversations neighbors might have. She had never come to his house. "I overheard something today," Margaret said, not sitting down, standing near the door as if ready to flee. "At the boarding house. I was delivering some mending to Mrs. Crawford, and I heard that man, Hendricks, speaking to someone, another man who arrived this afternoon." Thomas felt ice in his veins. Another man. "A sheriff from Virginia." Margaret's hands twisted together nervously. "I heard them talking about extradition, about bringing someone back to stand trial for an old crime, about how they had finally found the man they were looking for after all these years." The room seemed to tilt. Thomas gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. "That doesn't make sense. The crime, if there was a crime, happened in 1851. That was 38 years ago. There's no jurisdiction, no evidence." "I don't know about legal matters," Margaret said, "but I know what I heard. And I know that man Hendricks is not here to give you money, Mr. Whitmore. He's here to trap you." Thomas looked at her worried eyes, and the courage it must have taken to come here, to warn a man she barely knew, to risk her own reputation by involving herself in his affairs. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I know what it's like to be alone and vulnerable in a town that watches everything." Her voice was quiet but fierce. "Because I've seen how you keep to yourself, how careful you are, and I recognize that carefulness. It's the carefulness of someone who has learned that the world is not safe. And because those men mean you harm, Mr. Whitmore, whatever they're claiming, whatever they're offering, they mean you harm." After she left, Thomas sat in the darkness and tried to think clearly through the panic rising in his chest. Hendricks had not been offering him a choice at all. The money, the document, the promise of discretion, it had all been a performance, a way to extract a confession. And now there was a sheriff involved, and suddenly Thomas understood the true danger he was in. If they could get him back to Virginia on some pretext, some fabricated charge, he would disappear into a legal system that had never been designed to protect men like him. Even now, Decades after the war, after emancipation, after the promises of freedom, a colored man accused of killing a white woman would find no mercy in a Virginia courtroom. He had survived for 38 years by staying invisible. Now he was being pulled into the light, and the light would burn him alive. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with frost on the ground that crunched beneath Thomas's boots as he walked toward the center of town. He had not slept. He had spent the night sitting by the fire, holding the document Hendricks had given him, reading and rereading the account of events he had spent decades trying to forget. The account was accurate in its facts, but hollow in its understanding. It described Catherine's attempt to kill him as if it were an aberration, a moment of madness brought on by melancholy. It did not capture the years of hatred, the daily cruelty, the way she had looked at him as if his very existence was an offense against nature. It did not mention his mother at all, except as a kitchen slave who was sold south. As if Ruth had been a piece of furniture moved from one room to another, not a woman torn from her son and sent to die in a cotton field. The document made Edmund Hartwell sound noble, a man who had protected a slave from unjust punishment despite the risk to his own reputation. It did not mention that Edmund had fathered that slave, had used his power to take what he wanted from a woman who could not refuse him. It did not mention the lifetime of silence that had preceded that one moment of intervention. History, Thomas thought, was written by people who had never lived it. People who could afford to be generous in their interpretations because they had never felt the weight of the whip or the terror of being property. He found Hendricks at the boarding house, eating breakfast in the small dining room. The other man, the one Margaret had mentioned, was there as well. He was perhaps 50 years old, wearing a badge that identified him as a sheriff, though from which county Thomas could not tell. He looked at Thomas with the flat, evaluating gaze of someone accustomed to judging criminals. "Mr. Whitmore," Hendricks said, setting down his coffee cup, "I was hoping you'd join us. This is Sheriff Coleman from Albemarle County, Virginia. He's traveled quite a distance to speak with you." Thomas remained standing near the door, his hat in his hands. "What is this about?" "Please sit down," Hendricks gestured to an empty chair. "We have matters to discuss that require privacy." Thomas did not sit. "I know what you're doing. This isn't about inheritance or redemption. This is about forcing me back to Virginia to stand trial for something that happened 38 years ago." Sheriff Coleman leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanging. "There's no statute of limitations on murder, Mr. Whitmore, or should I call you Daniel? The Commonwealth of Virginia has an interest in resolving certain historical irregularities regarding the death of Catherine Beaumont Hartwell in April of 1851. There's nothing to resolve. Edmund Hartwell told the authorities his wife took her own life. That's what was recorded at the time. That's the official account. Edmund Hartwell lied, Hendricks said quietly. His son's confession makes that clear. And now that we have your admission that the event was, as you say, self-defense, we have sufficient grounds to reopen the investigation. Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and choking. "You tricked me into speaking. That admission means nothing." "On the contrary, it means everything." Hendricks folded his hands on the table. "The choice I offered you yesterday still stands. You can accept the inheritance, sign the agreement, and this matter will remain private. Or you can refuse, in which case Sheriff Coleman will be forced to pursue extradition proceedings. I assure you, the legal process will be lengthy, expensive, and deeply unpleasant for you." "I have no money for lawyers," Thomas said. "You know that. This entire situation is designed to force my cooperation through fear." "Not force," Hendricks corrected. "Encourage. We are offering you a substantial sum of money in exchange for your discretion. That seems more than fair, given the circumstances." Thomas looked from Hendricks to the sheriff and back again. He saw their calculation, their certainty that he would fold under pressure, that fear would drive him to sign whatever document they put in front of him. And he realized something in that moment that clarified everything like sunrise burning away fog. They could not actually force him back to Virginia. Not really. The legal grounds were too shaky, too dependent on proving things that could not be proven, but they could ruin him here in Millbrook. They could spread stories about his past, could create enough suspicion and fear that the town would turn against him. They could make his carefully built life impossible to maintain. "I need to think," Thomas said again. "You have until this evening," Hendricks replied. "After that, Sheriff Coleman will begin the formal proceedings." Thomas walked out of the boarding house and through the town, feeling eyes on him from every window and doorway. The whispers had grown louder overnight. Now people were openly staring, openly discussing him. He heard fragments as he passed. "Killed a white woman. That's why he came north." Always knew there was something wrong about him. The truth, as always, was being twisted into something uglier than reality. By afternoon, Thomas could feel the town turning against him like a living thing, like a body rejecting infection. When he went to the mill to discuss a job repairing some equipment, the foreman told him apologetically that the work had been given to someone else. When he stopped at the tavern for a meal, the owner served him, but suggested he might be more comfortable eating elsewhere. Only Margaret Foster sought him out. She found him sitting on a bench outside the church in the late afternoon, watching the sun sink toward the hills, and she sat down beside him without asking permission. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I don't know. You could run, leave tonight, go further west where they can't find you." Thomas shook his head. "I'm too old to run, and I've been running my whole life. I'm tired." "Then fight," Margaret said fiercely. "Fight them. Don't let them force you into anything." How Thomas looked at her. "I'm a colored man being accused of killing a white woman, even if it was decades ago and even if it was self-defense. There's no fight I can win against that." Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Tell your story, tell the truth, not to them, to us, to the town. Let people hear what really happened, not their version, yours." That evening, as the sun set and lamps were being lit in windows throughout Millbrook, Thomas did something he had not done in 38 years. He spoke the truth aloud. He went to the church and asked Reverend Walsh if he could address the congregation. Walsh was an elderly man, kind but cautious, and he hesitated at the unusual request. But there was something in Thomas's face, some desperate determination, that made him agree. Word spread quickly through the small town. By the time darkness had fully fallen, nearly every adult in Millbrook had gathered in the church, packed into the pews and standing along the walls. They came out of curiosity, out of suspicion, out of the universal human hunger to hear secrets revealed. Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman were there too, sitting in the back row, watching with expressions that mingled surprise and calculation. Thomas stood at the front of the church, his hands gripping the pulpit to keep them from shaking, and looked out at the sea of faces. White faces mostly, watching him with varying degrees of hostility and curiosity and pity. Margaret Foster sat in the third row, her expression encouraging, and Thomas began to speak. He told them about being born in Virginia in 1828, in the slave quarters of a plantation outside Charlottesville. He told them about eyes that marked him as different from the moment of his birth, eyes that everyone understood came from the master who had fathered him, but that no one dared mention. He told them about his mother Ruth, about her quiet strength and her eventual sale to a cotton plantation in Georgia, where she likely died before emancipation came. He told them about Catherine Hartwell and her hatred, about years of cruelty and torment, about being sold away after his mother was taken from him. He told them about the broken window and the gun and the struggle, about Catherine's intention to kill him and his desperate attempt to defend himself. And he told them about Edmund Hartwell's decision to cover up the crime, to claim his wife had taken her own life, to send Thomas away to a new owner and a chance at survival. He told them about the war, about walking away from Preston's farm and joining the Union Army, about fighting for his freedom and living to see slavery end. "I came north after the war," Thomas said, his voice steady now despite the trembling in his hands. "I changed my name and built a life here because I wanted to be free, not just legally free, but free from the past, from the weight of everything that had happened. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I never spoke about Virginia or the plantation or that night in the upstairs bedroom, I could leave it all behind. But the past doesn't stay buried. It finds you eventually, no matter how far you run or how long you hide." He looked directly at Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman. These men came here with what they claimed was an inheritance, but it was always a trap. They wanted me to confess so they could use my words against me. They wanted to force me to buy my own silence with money from the family that owned my mother and that tried to kill me. They wanted to protect the reputation of people who participated in a system that treated human beings as property. Thomas turned back to the congregation. I won't sign their document, I won't take their money, and I won't go back to Virginia to face charges for defending my own life. What happened in 1851 was terrible, but it was the result of a terrible system. Catherine Hartwell tried to murder me because my existence reminded her of what her husband had done to my mother. Edmund Hartwell covered it up because admitting the truth would have destroyed his family's reputation. And I survived because I fought back when fighting back was the only option left. The church was utterly silent. Thomas could hear his own breathing, could hear the creak of wood as people shifted in their seats. Then Margaret Foster stood up. I believe him, she said clearly, and I think if we were honest with ourselves, we'd all acknowledge that this man has lived peacefully in our town for 24 years. He's worked hard, bothered no one, and harmed no one. If those men want to drag him back to Virginia to face some kind of justice for events that happened before most of us were born, then we should ask ourselves what kind of justice that really is. There was a murmur of voices, some agreeing, some uncertain. Then old Hutchins, the farmer whose wagon Thomas had been repairing, stood up as well. I've known Thomas Whitmore for near 20 years, he said in his slow, deliberate way. He's a good carpenter and an honest man. If he says this is what happened, I believe him. One by one, others stood. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. Enough to show that the town would not simply hand him over, that there was some measure of protection in community, however fragile. Hendricks stood up from his seat in the back row, his expression cold with fury. This is highly irregular. Mr. Whitmore is attempting to manipulate public sentiment to avoid legal consequences. No, Margaret said, turning to face him. You attempted to manipulate him with threats and false promises. He's simply telling the truth. Sheriff Coleman stood as well, his hand moving instinctively toward his belt, where a weapon might have been, though he carried none visibly. The Commonwealth of Virginia has jurisdiction in this matter. Then let the Commonwealth of Virginia pursue it through proper legal channels, Reverend Walsh said quietly. He had remained seated until now, but his voice carried authority. But this man has committed no crime in Pennsylvania, and until proper extradition papers are filed and approved by a Pennsylvania court, he remains under our protection. The next days were strange and tense. Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman remained in Millbrook, lodging at the boarding house and clearly planning their next moves. But something had shifted. The town, which had begun to turn against Thomas, now seemed uncertain. People who had whispered about him now whispered about the men from Virginia instead, about their arrogance and their threats, about the unseemly way they had tried to trap Thomas with false offers of inheritance. Margaret Foster became Thomas's unexpected champion. She wrote letters to newspapers in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, describing the situation and asking for legal assistance. She spoke to everyone in town who would listen, telling them what she had overheard at the boarding house, sharing her suspicions about Hendricks's true intentions. They're afraid, she told Thomas one morning when she came to his house with fresh bread she had baked. Not of justice, they're afraid of shame. The Hartwell family doesn't want their history exposed. That's why they sent Hendricks. They thought they could frighten you into silence. They nearly succeeded, Thomas admitted. But they didn't. Margaret set the bread on his table. You have to understand something, Thomas, Mr. Whitmore. What you did, speaking in the church, telling your story, that took more courage than they've ever had to summon in their comfortable lives. They've spent decades protecting themselves with money and position and carefully maintained reputations. You've survived by enduring. A lawyer arrived from Pittsburgh 3 days later. His name was Abraham Frost, and he had been contacted by one of the newspapers Margaret had written to. He was perhaps 40 years old, a freedman himself who had worked his way through law school after the war and now made his practice defending people who had no other advocates. Frost met with Thomas in his small house and listened to the entire story, taking notes in careful handwriting. When Thomas finished, Frost set down his pen and looked at him seriously. "They have no case," he said flatly. "The events took place 38 years ago in Virginia. You were enslaved at the time, which means you had no legal personhood under Virginia law as it existed in 1851. You cannot be prosecuted now for actions you took while you were considered property. Additionally, there is no body of evidence beyond Ned Hartwell's posthumous confession, which is hearsay and would never be admitted in court. And finally, you acted in self-defense against someone attempting to murder you. Even if they somehow managed to bring you to trial, which they cannot, you would have a complete defense." "Then why are they doing this?" Thomas asked. "Intimidation. They're hoping you'll panic and either pay them to go away or flee, which would make you look guilty. But legally, they have nothing. I will file papers with the court here in Pennsylvania formally objecting to any extradition attempt. I will also make it clear to Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman that any further harassment will result in charges of their own." Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, flickered in Thomas's chest. "How much will your services cost?" "Nothing," Frost said. "Consider this my contribution to justice." When Frost confronted Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman at the boarding house, their masks of authority crumbled quickly. Faced with an actual lawyer who knew the law and was willing to fight, they had no ground to stand on. Hendricks blustered about the moral obligations of resolving historical crimes, but when Frost threatened to file complaints with the Virginia Bar Association regarding Hendricks's deceptive practices, the man grew quiet. Sheriff Coleman admitted, when pressed, that he had no formal extradition papers and no actual authority to compel Thomas to return to Virginia. He had come as a favor to Hendricks, hoping that his presence as law enforcement would be intimidating enough to force cooperation. Now, faced with actual legal resistance, he backed down. "This isn't over," Hendricks said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Oh, I think it is," Frost replied. "And if you continue to harass my client, I will ensure that every newspaper in Pennsylvania and Virginia knows exactly what the Hartwell family attempted to do here. I suspect the scandal of trying to prosecute a freedman for defending himself against a murderous slave owner's wife will do far more damage to their precious reputation than simply letting the matter rest." Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman left Millbrook the next morning. They departed quietly, without fanfare, the carriage rolling out of town in the gray dawn light. Thomas watched them go from his window and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not realized he was carrying. In the weeks that followed, life in Millbrook slowly returned to normal, but it was a changed normal. People looked at Thomas differently now. Some with pity, some with respect, some with the uncomfortable awareness that comes from confronting a past they would rather forget. The church held a special service, acknowledging the injustices of slavery and asking for God's guidance in building a more just community. Reverend Walsh spoke about the importance of bearing witness to truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Margaret Foster read a passage from Exodus about freeing the captive, and Thomas sat in his usual seat near the back, feeling for the first time in decades that he belonged somewhere. Hutchins came to him with more work, actual work that needed doing, not just charity. Other farmers followed. The mill owner offered him a permanent position maintaining their equipment. Slowly, steadily, Thomas found himself woven back into the fabric of the town's life, no longer invisible but genuinely seen. Margaret Foster visited him often. They would sit on his porch in the evenings as autumn deepened into winter, talking about small things and large things, about the past and the future, about what it meant to survive and what it meant to truly live. She told him about her marriage, about her husband who had been kind but distant, about the loneliness she had felt even before he died. He told her about his mother, about memories he had kept locked away for decades, about Ruth's hands and her voice, and the way she had loved him despite everything. "Do you think she knew?" Margaret asked one evening. "Your mother, do you think she ever knew you survived, that you made it through the war and found freedom?" "No," Thomas said quietly. "She was sold in 1851. She would have been in Georgia when the war started, and those plantations, they didn't survive the war intact. Even if she lived until emancipation, she would have been in her 50s, worn out from hard labor, and she had no way of finding me. I changed my name, I disappeared." But she would have hoped, Margaret said. That's what mothers do, they hope. Yes, Thomas felt his throat tighten. She would have hoped. As winter deepened and snow began to fall on Millbrook, Thomas received a letter. It came from Charlottesville, Virginia, and for a moment he considered burning it unread. But curiosity won out, and he opened it carefully. The letter was from a woman named Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison, Edmund Hartwell Jr.'s daughter. She wrote in careful, educated script, her words measured and formal, apologizing for the actions of Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman, explaining that they had been hired by her brother against her wishes, that she had been horrified when she learned what they had attempted. My father's confession has haunted our family for months, she wrote. Learning the truth about my grandmother's death, about my grandfather's cover-up, about your existence and your suffering, has forced us to confront the reality of what our family was and what we benefited from. The money my father left to you in his will, it was not meant as a bribe or a trap. It was meant as an inadequate but sincere attempt at restitution. If you are willing to accept it, it will be transferred to your account without any conditions or requirements for silence. If you prefer not to accept it, we will respect that decision. But please know that at least some members of the Hartwell family acknowledge what was done to you and to your mother, and we are deeply sorry. Thomas sat with the letter for a long time, reading and rereading it. $20,000. It was still an impossible sum, more money than he could earn in 10 lifetimes of carpentry work. It could transform his remaining years, could provide security and comfort he had never known. He showed the letter to Margaret, asking for her thoughts. It's not about the money, she said after reading it carefully. It's about what accepting it would mean. Would it feel like forgiveness, like endorsement, like permission for them to feel better about I don't know, Thomas admitted. I don't think I have the right to forgive on my mother's behalf. She's the one who was taken and sold and who died in bondage. I survived, she didn't. But you're the one who's here, Margaret said gently, and you're the one who gets to decide what comes next. Thomas thought about it for days. He thought about his mother and what she would want. He thought about the years of silence and survival, about the price he had paid for simply existing. He thought about Catherine Hartwell's hatred and Edmund Hartwell's guilty mercy and Ned Hartwell's posthumous confession. Finally, he wrote back to Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison. He accepted the money, but with conditions. Half would be placed in trust to provide scholarships for colored children seeking education. The other half he would use to live comfortably in his final years, and whatever remained at his death would go to the same scholarship fund. Your family's wealth was built on the labor of enslaved people, he wrote, including my mother and myself. If you truly wish to make amends, then let that wealth serve those who were denied education and opportunity. Let it build futures that slavery tried to prevent, that would honor my mother's memory more than any amount given to me alone. Spring came to Millbrook, and with it, a sense of renewal. Thomas continued his work, building and repairing, his hands as skilled as ever despite his years. But now he also had time to sit on his porch and watch the world, to tend a small garden, to read books that Margaret brought him from the school's library. The scholarship fund became real, administered through a bank in Pittsburgh, providing education for colored children throughout Pennsylvania. The first recipients were announced in the summer of 1890, and their names were published in the newspaper. Thomas read them aloud to Margaret, his voice catching with emotion he did not try to hide. Look at this, he said, pointing to one name. Ruth Harris, 16 years old, attending the normal school to become a teacher. Ruth, that was my mother's name. I know, Margaret said softly. She had helped him choose the name for the scholarship fund, the Ruth Harris Memorial Education Fund. Thomas and Margaret grew closer as the seasons turned. He was past the age where propriety demanded certain kinds of relationships, and so was she, but they found comfort in companionship, in quiet evenings and shared meals, and the easy intimacy of people who had both survived losses and learned to live with scars. The town accepted their friendship without much comment. Millbrook was small enough that people could not afford to be too rigid about such things, and after what had happened with Hendricks and the confrontation in the church, There was a sense that Thomas had earned his place among them. In the autumn of 1890, Thomas received another letter from Virginia. This one was from Elizabeth Hartwell Morrison again, informing him that the family cemetery at the old Hartwell plantation was being restored and maintained, and that a small marker was being placed there acknowledging the enslaved people who had lived and worked at the plantation. "It's not enough," she wrote. "Nothing could be enough, but we wanted you to know that Ruth is named there, your mother is named there, she is remembered." Thomas wept when he read that letter, great shaking sobs that came from somewhere so deep he had not known it existed. Margaret held him while he cried, and did not tell him to be strong or to let go of grief. She simply held him and let him mourn for the mother he had lost 63 years ago, for all the years of silence and all the pain that could not be undone. As winter approached again, Thomas grew ill, nothing sudden or dramatic, just the slow decline of a body that had endured too much for too long. He took to his bed in late November, and Margaret moved into the second room of his house to care for him. On a cold December morning, with snow falling outside the window, Thomas woke to find Margaret sitting beside his bed, reading aloud from a book. He recognized the passage, something about justice and mercy and the long arc of the universe bending toward righteousness. "I'm tired," he said quietly. "I know. I think I'd like to rest now." "Then rest," Margaret said, taking his hand. "You've earned it." Thomas closed his eyes. He thought about his mother's face, about her gentle hands and her voice telling him to survive. He thought about Catherine Hartwell's hatred and Edmund Hartwell's guilty mercy. He thought about the tobacco fields and the war and the long journey north. He thought about building this house and this life, about finding some measure of peace in Millbrook. And he thought about those blue eyes that had marked him from birth, that had been a curse and a burden and a constant reminder of things people wanted to forget. Those eyes that had made him visible when he wanted only to disappear, but that had also marked him as human, as someone who could not be erased no matter how much people tried. Thomas Whitmore died on December 15, 1890, at the age of 62. His funeral was held at the church, and the town turned out to mourn him. Margaret Foster spoke about his courage, about the weight he had carried for decades, about the truth he had finally been brave enough to speak. Reverend Walsh read from the Psalms. The scholarship students who lived nearby attended, wearing black and carrying flowers. He was buried in the town cemetery, in a plot Margaret had purchased beside the space reserved for herself. His headstone was simple, carved from local granite by a stonemason who had known him for years. Thomas Whitmore, 1828–1890. He survived. He endured. He told the truth. In the spring, Margaret planted flowers on his grave, blue flowers that bloomed year after year. And in the years that followed, students who benefited from the Ruth Harris Memorial Education Fund would sometimes visit Millbrook, would ask about the man who had created the fund, would stand by his grave and wonder at the story it hinted at but did not fully tell. The full story remained in documents scattered across courthouses in Virginia and Pennsylvania, in census records that noted unusual eye color, in letters preserved by the Hartwell family. Some historians would find pieces of it over the years, would try to assemble the fragments into something coherent. But the emotional truth, the weight of living with a past you could not escape and a present you could barely hold on to, that truth lived only in the memories of people who had known Thomas and in the lives changed by the scholarships that bore his mother's name. The past does not stay buried. It surfaces in unexpected ways, in blue eyes and old documents and stories told in churches on cold autumn evenings. It surfaces in the choice to speak or to remain silent, to fight or to flee, to forgive or to simply survive. Thomas Whitmore had done all of those things. He had survived and endured, and finally, in the last years of his life, he had found something that went beyond survival. He had found witnesses. He had found people willing to hear his truth and to honor it. He had found a way to transform suffering into something that might prevent other suffering, to take the wealth built on his mother's bondage and use it to build futures she had been denied. It was not justice, not really, Justice would have meant Ruth never being enslaved, never being raped, never being sold away from her son. Justice would have meant Thomas growing up free, with a father who acknowledged him and a life defined by possibility rather than constraint. But it was something, it was acknowledgement, it was memory, it was the refusal to let silence win. And sometimes, in a world built on cruelty and maintained by forgetting, simply refusing to be silent